You travel a lot and you support liberty groups in many countries. Do you think generally the world is becoming freer?
Certainly the long-term tendency since the end of the Second World War has been very positive. In some countries, the last 10 years have been negative. I think the United States is an example of a country that has become less free in many areas, not all, during that period. We've won some victories, even in the United States. I think that same-gender marriage equality, legalization of marijuana, these are important. But we've seen an economic policy at the same time a sliding back and increasing state power and the national security state spying on people and reading their emails and other things that are unacceptable in a free society. By and large, I think most of the rest of the world has been improving in terms of the freedom enjoyed by average citizens. In Asia and Africa and Latin America, this is definitely the case. So all in all, I think the world is becoming a more free place, but some places more and other places less.
Do you think that the only way to prosperity leads through liberalization, or are there any alternative ways? Because some countries are usually used, like Singapore, as examples of alternative ways to prosperity.
Well, Singapore is an interesting case study. They do very well on economic freedom. If you come from Canada and Korea and you want to do business there, they don't really interfere, and they create a very stable rule of law that's highly reliable. But these are outliers cases. Dubai, Singapore, Hong Kong are interesting examples. They have created substantial rule of law societies, certainly for economic activity, but they're not good models of free societies. They're not replicable. They're outliers. I think that the evidence shows very robustly that open democratic principles, principles of rule of law, principles of free and open media correspond very robustly to economic freedom as well. It is a package deal. We don't get to pick and choose which freedoms we want. Some of them go together well with others. And if you look at the data in the aggregate, you find a very robust, strong positive correlation between institutions of political freedom, civil freedom, and economic freedom. These three all go together very strongly. There are some statistical outliers like Singapore, but I think those cases are unique. We should look at the overall picture, and it's very, very strong. Looking at countries such as Ukraine and Russia, I don't think there's any question that open democratic political structures, civil freedoms and economic freedoms are a package deal. You can't just pick and choose which ones you want.
Mm-hmm. But we may like it or not, but the majority of people, as far as I think, they are concerned about prosperity much more than about human rights. Are they wrong?
It depends on which people. Dissidents who get in prison are often very concerned about the right to freedom of speech and so on, even though the bulk of the population may not be. What we've seen in some countries, Russia would be a good example, a kind of deal that the authorities offered, which was, we'll bring consumer goods, all the oil money that's sloshed into Russia, don't worry about these political freedoms. But the problem is that was dependent on high oil prices, not on an actual economy based on economic freedom. And the consequence is now collapsing prosperity and no freedoms, no political freedoms. And I don't think that that's going to be very attractive in the long run. The other point that needs to be taken into account is the stability of such regimes. When Mr. Putin dies, what's going to happen in Russia? I don't think anyone really knows. There's not a very clear plan, because it all depends on this one person in a small circle around him who make all the decisions for the country. That means that there isn't a normal democratic procedure for handing over of power. There can't be an opposition that could take power. In the long run, this is not good for the country, even though people feel at any given moment they have more security because someone has a strong hand. In the long run, this does not make the country more secure, and it certainly is not good for prosperity over the long run.
On the other hand, there is another point of view that creating a stable middle class inevitably leads to the public demand on human rights and civil liberties, and maybe that's what we saw in Russia when the GDP has grown. We saw massive protests of people who wanted free elections. Do you think that this theory is right?
There's a strong connection between a growing middle class and demands for democratic liberalization. So we saw this in Korea as an example. It was a military dictatorship with strong men. They joined the GATT, the General Agreement on Trade and Tariffs, 1966. And you saw increasing prosperity through this time. They liberalized their economy, growing middle class, who demanded political participation, and now they have a more or less normal democratic country with an opposition and a parliament and changes in power from one party to the next. That is a model that we've seen replicated in a number of other countries as well, in Latin America and in Asia. I don't think that these models mean inevitability. It's not like a physics equation. We're talking about what makes it more or less likely. I think that in the case of Russia, we've seen a process that many people were optimistic about go off track. And the reason was the state reliance on one single commodity, oil revenues, and then other primary commodities, mining and natural gas and so on, but fundamentally oil revenues. And that drove the state to, in effect, lead the leaders to say, we don't need a rule of law. We have oil. We can buy whatever we want. We can bribe any segment of the population. We could give them consumer goods. And that meant that having an economy that was so dependent on one commodity, Russia unfortunately has not developed many other industries as a consequence. It's become so reliant on one source of income. And the state budget is heavily reliant on it rather than on a broad-based a tax base for the population. That has really derailed the movement dramatically to political liberalization. I am not so pessimistic. I think it can get back on track. But the rising oil price, in a case where it was effectively not a state monopoly initially, but the state was in the dominant position, and then moved to eliminate private players in the petroleum industry, meant that they've created a classical petrostate. And petrostates are not really compatible with democratic pluralism. Here's the principle behind it. If you had the rule of law already, a well-established constitutional liberal democracy, and then you develop oil, you discover oil, it's not so bad. Canada, United States, Norway, Great Britain. If you don't have rule of law and then discover oil, it's probably going to be a catastrophe for your country. And I think Russia took that second path. I don't think it is incorrigible. I think it can be corrected, but it has really been, I think, very harmful to Russia's political development. In some sense, Ukraine is lucky in not having a single commodity like oil that dominates the economy. They're much more likely to develop a broad-based economic system with a multitude of sectors, no one of which can be dominated or monopolized by the state authorities.
Yes, here in Ukraine we see a very different situation. People are deeply concerned about political and civil liberties, and they enjoy those civil liberties. The country is politically free, but the economy is still struggling. Is this a way to fix the situation?
Well, I think that there is a window of opportunity for Ukraine, but it will not be open forever. And people should really be aware that they could lose their country. This country could collapse and fall to pieces if they don't get things right within the next, let's say, 1.5 to 2 years. There are key reforms that could be implemented to bring about macroeconomic stabilization. That's a fancy, big term. It just means not having your money lose its value dramatically. That's really the key, is to have a stable monetary system, and the hryvnia up until now has not been that. It has been badly managed currency. To open the economy, Ukraine has one of the most difficult economies for doing business internationally. It is needlessly difficult to import and export from this country. They had implemented under previous democratic governments all kinds of extremely harmful protectionist measures that make it more difficult to import, so it raises the cost for domestic consumers and domestic producers, and at the same time it makes it more costly to export. There's a principle in international trade economics that says if you make it costly to import, at the same time you make it costly to export, means you're really strangling and killing your economy for the benefit of a small number of privileged producers who enjoy those monopolies. There are things that can be done in Ukraine. It takes good political sense to push those through, but I'll be really frank, it's not rocket science as to what works. We have seen in countries that have liberalized, New Zealand, Georgia, Poland, and others, what works. The question is to develop the political constituency and the vision among political leaders and enough of the population to make it happen. It does mean short-term costs, but there'll be enormous long-term benefits. And quite frankly, Ukraine has suffered so much in the last several years because of the armed conflict and other problems that have faced the country, that the cost, the period of pain, should actually be pretty short compared to the period of recovery. So I'm fairly optimistic that if there's a political will, they can get it right in this country.
There are many people who were participants of the Revolution of Dignity of Euromaidan who are now quite disappointed because they see the reforms being performed too slow or not being performed at all. Is there a way for them to influence on the authorities to push them in the right direction?
I think so. I think what needs to be done is for people who have an ideal of the future prosperity of the country to combat populism. This has been a big problem in Ukraine, populism. One way to look at Ukrainian politics is that they haven't had political parties, they've had political leaders, and then movements coalesce around particular charismatic leaders. This is not good for the long term of the country. There needs to be the development not merely of personality-based politics, but of actual programs, of platforms where politicians and their parties are committed to a reform process and lay out, this is what we're going to do, and explain it in clear language, rather than charismatic attraction to people who are beautiful or handsome or tall or good-looking. That should be left in the past, and people should focus on the principles that work rather than the personalities of popular or glamorous political leaders. So if that happens, if they develop a real political culture here in Ukraine based on principles, I think that can work. But it means citizens need to stand up and say, that's what we want. We're not interested in who has the best hairstyle or who's the most fabulous speaker or who has the most electric personality. We want a program that makes sense. In the past, people such as Viktor Penzenik tried to offer this to the public, and I don't think it was the right time. He had the right ideas, he tried to implement the right things, but he ran up against a deeply populist political culture at the time. My sense is enough Ukrainians are sick of that they'd like to talk about a politics of principles and reform rather than political glamour.
Should they create a new party that would be based on principles, or are there other options that are better to make a change?
I'm not enough of a political scientist in the Ukrainian sense to offer that kind of concrete advice. I do think that an actual principled liberal party that promotes sound reforms is possible in Ukraine, and I would like to see it happen. It's not so easy in the contemporary Ukrainian political system to just found a new party, or let me put it another way. It's easy to found a new party. It's difficult to bring together enough people to make it viable and to have a parliamentary representation. The other option, though, is to create citizens' lobbies that will demand these policies of politicians. They don't have to be parties per se with candidates, but are willing to hold candidates' feet to the fire and offer constructive solutions and be critical of those politicians who won't implement them. So a mass-based movement of that sort, I think, also has a possibility. And then the last thing, I think students in this country are an underappreciated resource for the future, because the vast majority of young people who are thinking long-term about the future of the country, they have parents and they have grandparents. And they need to go and talk to them about abandoning this kind of populist policy or clinging to the old Soviet structures that are not viable, and say what is going to be good for the future of the country, for the future of those children and of their children yet to be born. When it's phrased in those terms, many of the people, including older generations who have been resistant, can change and think about the country's future, and not only clinging to a dead past.
In your opinion, will the alliance, closer alliance with Europe, which was one of the main purposes of Euromaidan, beneficial for the Ukrainians?
Depends on the way in which it's done. The politics of that was very interesting. I think the previous president went to Europe because he thought they would give him money. He had bankrupted the country, and he spent all the money and bankrupted even the central bank. And his sense was, I'm broke, I need to go get money from someplace else, maybe they'll give me money. When he then got the call from Moscow, from the Tsar, who said, hey, come here, I'll give you the money. I think it was at that point that many Ukrainians asked, what did you sell our country for? What was happening there? Did you sell Ukraine to someone? And they became very angry about this. They wanted to be able to trade freely with the world. So I don't think, at least my interpretation as a foreigner, that it was an anti-Russian move. Happy to have friendly relations with everyone, but they wanted to be open to and be able to participate in economic relations with the wider world and not be locked into a Eurasian Union, which was Mr. Putin's vision as a competitor to the European Union. That clearly was a route to poverty, to nowhere. If they create free trade relations and free travel relations with the European Union, I think this will be a very positive thing for everybody. It doesn't have to be at the expense of anyone else, certainly not Russia. But to become integrated into the European Union and just adopt all the European institutions, I think would be a mistake. The reason is, if you're a very wealthy country, you can afford some really stupid policies. And the European Union sometimes exports these. If you're a very poor country, you cannot afford them. I'll take a very simple example. Some European countries, France as an example, has a rather difficult labor code. It's not an accident that they have rather high unemployment rates. It's difficult to hire people. They have non-integrated immigrant population in France as a consequence. Ukraine needs an open, free labor market where it's easy to create new jobs, it's easy to get a job. This is very, very important. And adopting wholesale American or Canadian or European Union labor regulations, I think would be a mistake for the country. In effect, Ukraine cannot afford them. It needs to generate a lot more wealth before they could afford foolish and destructive policies like that.